Hey, what's up guys? Today, I'll show you a supernatural comedy film, RIPD. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The movie begins with a police officer named Nick telling us that his life is much harder than ours, as he chases after some monster criminals with his ghost partner, Roy. Nick explains that he's in the Rest in Peace department, called RIPD for short. Then the scene flashbacks to around 4 days ago. Nick digs up his backyard so that he can hide some of the gold that he got from a recent bust. He covers up the gold with an orange tree, and then he meets his French wife named Wifey. Nick is worried about their financial situation, but Wifey says she loves him for who he is. Now, Wifey goes out for a jog while Nick goes to the police station for work. There, he meets his human partner named Corrupt, who has also kept some gold from the recent bust. Corrupt has to deal with a naked officer in the locker room, and then he goes to Nick to discuss where he's hidden his share of the gold. However, Nick feels guilty and wants to get out of this arrangement. Corrupt doesn't like this idea, but eventually agrees with Nick. Suddenly, the officers are told that there's a lead on a hot case, so they get into their vans and head toward the target. The officers reach the building, where their target is hiding. Nick leads the way along with Corrupt, who shoots down the entrance to the building. An intense shootout follows between the cops and the criminals hiding inside. Nick spots his target, so he goes after him while the others continue to engage in gunfire. The target eventually gets away, and Nick gets upset, but then Corrupt shows up and betrays Nick by shooting him multiple times. Nick falls to the ground and is confirmed to be dead, but then he gets up and witnesses everything being frozen in time. He is absorbed by a mysterious portal that takes him to another dimension. Suddenly, he finds himself in an office with a lady cop. Nick doesn't know what's going on, and then Lady Cop explains that he's in the afterlife. However, since Nick has good police skills, Lady Cop offers him a chance to serve as a RIPD officer, but warns Nick that he has to face judgment for being a dirty cop if he refuses this offer. Lady Cop offers him 100 extra years to live, so he happily accepts it immediately. She then takes Nick through a prison cell full of monsters and explains that the RIPD has been arresting such monsters ever since 1954 in order to avoid global catastrophes. Nick is later taken into the official RIPD department, where he is to meet his new partner, Roy. However, one of the monsters breaks free and wreaks havoc in the office. Things look tricky at first, but then Roy shows up and blasts the monster with his soul-killer gun. Roy reveals himself to be a cowboy and doesn't seem to care about the RIPD rules even though he is scolded by Lady Cop. Roy meets Nick, but says that he doesn't want a partner. However, Lady Cop forces Roy to do as she says. Roy makes fun of Nick and takes him back to the real world through a smelly toilet portal. He then escorts Nick to his funeral, where not many people have turned up to honor his death. Roy makes fun of Nick as he watches Corrupt flirting his wife's hormones, and it makes Nick very angry. He goes to his wife, hoping to be reunited with her, but she doesn't recognize him, and the cops take him away from her. Nick also notices Corrupt and attacks him out of spite for being a dick. After Nick is thrown away, Roy explains to him that RIPD officers don't look like themselves in this world, as they have other avatars. That's when Nick realizes that he looks like an old Chinese man, and Roy looks like a hot blonde baby. A couple of weirdos stare at Roy's hormones, and then the partners drive into the city. Roy seems to have a thing for ankles, and it creeped out Nick. Roy then reveals that he was a lawman from the 1800s and had died with coyotes devouring his body. Roy continues annoying Nick, and this leads to some friction between the partners. Then we learn that Roy was also betrayed by his partner when he was alive, and this is why he is so hesitant to take on a new partner. The officers have a bit of an argument, and then they go to investigate a suspected monster in a residential building. Roy takes some bait with him, and then he gives Nick some soul-killer guns as they enter the lift. Roy makes a comment on Nick's ankles, so he becomes conscious and asks him not to be creepy. The partners enter a secret section of the building that only they are able to see. Nick says he wants to take the lead because he has 15 years of experience. However, Roy tells him to shove his experience down the drain because they are of no use in this situation. Eventually, Roy enters the room and confronts the suspected monster, who is in his human form. As part of the investigation, Nick keeps mentioning Indian food to the monster, and Roy keeps munching on Indian food to annoy him. These tactics eventually trigger the monster's transformation, and Nick is scared to see such an ugly sight. Roy motivates him to make the arrest, but this turns out to be a bad idea, as the monster counters Nick and cuffs him instead. The monster starts to throw all kinds of items at the partners, and then he takes off his arm to distract them. The monster tries to make a run for it by jumping out of the window, but hilariously crashes to the ground. However, he doesn't die and is about to escape, so Roy acts fast and jumps onto Nick. He uses his cowboy skills to use Nick as his ride down the building, and they eventually land on the monster. This makes Nick a little pissed off, so he angrily whacks the monster with fierce hatred. Suddenly, the monster spits out the same gold that Nick and Corrupt had stolen. This makes Nick confused, but Roy kills the monster and annoys Nick once more by rating his performance. Nick doesn't like his constant bullshit talking, so he tells him to shut up his smelly mouth. Roy doesn't listen, so Nick loses his patience and throws Roy in front of a bus. Roy ends up losing his hat and becomes emotional. The partners go back to the RIPD office and learn that there's an emergency because a lot of monsters have been showing up in public. Roy hands over the gold as evidence, but Nick suspects something fishy because he feels there's a link between the sudden rise of monsters and the gold. Roy doesn't really care about Nick's theories, so Nick has to stroke his ego for a bit. He finally convinces Roy to take him to one of his informants so that he can understand what's so important about the gold. Roy and Nick go to a baseball game and interrogate Roy's informant. The informant acts cocky at first, but then Nick smacks him in the face. The informant eventually complies to Nick's demands, but says that the gold is of no use. However, the informant seems to get excited when Nick leaves the gold with him, and Nick notices this. He and Roy keep a watch on the informant, and then they notice him giving the gold to Corrupt. Roy starts to believe Nick's theory, so the partners chase after Corrupt. They find Corrupt at Nick's house, and Roy thinks that Corrupt is sharing hormones with Nick's wife. Nick doesn't want to believe this, so he places a bet with Roy, saying that he will shoot him in the face if he wins the bet. The partners spy on Corrupt as he tells Wifey that Nick was hiding something from her. Wifey tells Corrupt about the orange tree in the backyard, so he immediately lifts up the tree and shows all the gold that Nick had left there. This makes Wifey upset and Nick feels emotional, but Roy wants an explanation as to why Nick was stocking up so much gold. Nick reasons that he only wanted to make a better life for his wife, but Roy continues to insult Nick, so he gets punched in the face multiple times. Corrupt leaves with the gold, so the partners chase after him. They follow Corrupt to a secret meeting point, but are interrupted when a music video director flirts with Roy's hot blonde avatar. Roy insults the director's poor hormones and shoos him away so that they can focus on their mission. They spot a fat monster named Fatty taking the gold from Corrupt, so they immediately arrest Fatty and take him to a meat freezer to get some info. Nick and Roy try to tease Fatty with some drug, causing him to transform into a super fatty. Fatty runs his fat butt away, and the partners chase after his diabetic smell, but he is too difficult to catch despite being overweight, and he ventures out into the open. Roy latches onto Fatty's fat butt, but gets dragged across buildings and eventually into an office, where some creepy businessmen stare at his sexy female avatar. Meanwhile, Nick gets hit by a car, but manages to get back up and rushes to the office to help Roy. Fatty tries jumping down the lift, but Nick goes up the lift to counter him. Chaos follows, but Fatty still manages to escape and becomes the lead story on all the news channels. Back at the RIPD office, Lady Cop gets pissed at Roy and Nick for messing up their mission, so she takes them to Eternal Affairs, hoping that the partners will be punished for their goof up. However, Lady Cop learns that the partners actually did something good because the gold chunks are a part of the staff of Jericho, which can be used to reverse the afterlife and make the dead rain upon the earth. Lady Cop explains that the staff was broken into 5,000 pieces ages ago, but somehow the monsters have finally been able to collect all the pieces apart from the ones at the RIPD office. Roy and Nick want to stop the monsters, but they are told that they are suspended and will be erased for allowing the humans to see Fatty. This makes them both upset, and then Nick decides to go see his wife at the jogging track. He walks up to her and tries to feel her. She seems to recognize him despite his Chinese avatar. However, Wifey gets creeped out and leaves. Roy shows up and tells Nick that he shouldn't scare his wife, but rather let her start a new life without him. Nick gets upset with Roy and starts shouting at him. He takes it a bit too far when he says that the coyotes that devoured Roy's body should have humped his eye sockets as well. This severely affects Roy, so he starts singing a sad song. Nick realizes his mistake and apologizes to Roy. After that, they decide to work together to stop the apocalypse. Suddenly, they realize that Corrupt is actually a monster who is masking himself with a medal. Meanwhile, Corrupt finds a monster friend and gives him one half of a magic orb. The next day, Wifey calls Corrupt and tells him about her encounter with the Chinese man. She believes that she was actually talking to Nick, but Corrupt changes the topic and asks Wifey out to lunch. Corrupt gets interrupted by Roy, who is at his door, but he decides to entertain him because he can see his female avatar. Corrupt can't wait to smell Roy's bad body flavor, and this distraction allows Nick to take him hostage. Roy and Nick force Corrupt to take off his medal, and he complies, thus revealing his smelly monster stink. Roy finds the first half of the staff of Jericho and hands it over to the Ripped office along with Corrupt. Roy basks in the glory of this success, and then we learn that he had also shared hormones with Lady Cop once upon a time. However, Corrupt hands over his half of the magic orb, which gets connected to the other half he had given to his monster friend, who has also been apprehended here. It turns out the whole thing was a trap, so that the magic orb could activate and freeze all the Ripped cops. Corrupt and his monsters use this opportunity to steal all the gold that was kept here as well. Roy breaks the time barrier, but it's too late as Corrupt and the monsters have escaped. Now, the monsters wreak havoc upon the real world, so the Ripped cops get into an all-out shootout with them. Roy also gets into his element and kills a lot of monsters with his impressive guns. However, a portal hole is formed thanks to the staff, so the partners chase after it. Meanwhile, Corrupt sends his monsters to bring Wifey to him. Roy and Nick make their way to the portal hole in an intense sequence, and they eventually bump into Fatty again. This time, they finally manage to trap Fatty and end his diabetic life. Wifey is brought in front of Corrupt, so he finally shows her his true form. He starts the staff of Jericho and tells Wifey that he must sacrifice her to complete the ritual. Luckily, Roy and Nick arrive and start a fierce shootout. Unfortunately, Corrupt severely injures Wifey, and it makes Nick mad. He goes for Corrupt, while Roy goes for the staff. Nick shoots through a lot of monsters, but runs out of bullets when he comes to Corrupt. Nick and Corrupt get into a fistfight, while Roy struggles to stop the staff. Nick gets beaten down and begs Roy to act fast, so Roy pulls out some cowboy moves. He uses his lasso and latches onto a construction vehicle, after which he destroys the staff with it. The portal gets killed, and then Nick finally kills Corrupt with his soul killer gun. Wifey seems to be crossing over to the afterlife, and she finally sees Nick in his true form. The couple kiss each other with their juicy tongues, and then Wifey says that she wants to die, so that she can be with Nick forever. However, Nick tells her that she must live her life without him. Wifey emotionally agrees, and then she wakes up in a hospital room. Lady Cop checks up on her and tells Nick she has helped his wife survive her injuries. Now, Roy is given 53 more years as a term punishment, so he starts complaining. However, Lady Cop gives him a new hat and bites his sexy beard, so he stops complaining. The movie ends with Roy giving Nick a new avatar, but it turns out to be a geeky girl. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.